Alright, hi everyone, thank you for coming to this class. Today we will talk about Republic Fleet Firetail. This will be the last class about combat navy frigates. Previously I have covered Slicer, Hookbill and the Comet. So now we are going into a slightly off-meta frigs. And if you will have any questions during the class, then please feel free to ask them in the Classroom Alpha channel on Discord. Today we will talk about firstly one page of key theoretical concepts of Frigate PVP. This will be useful for you for the later slides because I will refer to these concepts over and over again. When I will talk about the ship profile itself, what are the bonuses, strengths, weaknesses, how do you usually fit and use them. When we will go into details about the most popular fits and their strengths and weaknesses. Finally, one page about the engagement map, what you can fight, what you shouldn't fight, and so on. And a short Q&A at the end. Overall, I think it should take less than an hour. Okay, let's start first with key theory of Frigate PVP. So first of all, I want you to look at this picture. It shows the damage over distance for several Tech 1 frigates. There are 4 frigates on this graph. The red line is the Blaster Merlin with Void loaded. The green line is the Rocket Condor with Rage loaded. The orange line is the Beam Executioner with X-ray loaded. And the blue line is the Kiting Condor with light missiles and faction ammo loaded. So what you can see is that every frigate tends to perform better than the rest at a specific range of engagement. For example, Merlin, as you can see, will out DPS all other ships around 2.5 kilometers. When Rocket Condor will out damage all other ships between 4 and 8, maybe 9 kilometers. Then there is a range for Executioner, and at the very end, the perfect range for a Condor. This logic actually applies to pretty much any frigate and any fleet in the game. Even if you load like a null into the Blaster Merlin, null is a long range ammo for blasters, it will still be below its Scrum Kiting range when specialized ships like a Rocket Condor. So what does it mean for you? Basically, every ship prefers to fight at a specific range. And for frigate PvP it's especially important because you generally do not have a sustainable tank. So you cannot permanently tank the incoming damage. Therefore, it's very important to maximize your damage while minimizing the damage of your opponent. And when you think about the upcoming fight, you can generally classify any ship, any frigate in the game into one of the 5 styles, depending on what range this ship will generally like to fight. The short-range ships are called brawlers. These are usually blaster and autocannon frigates. Sometimes like Tristan can be brawling as well. Ships that like to fight between 5 and 9 to 10 kilometers are called Scrum Kiters because they usually fight at the edge of Scrum range, which is 9 kilometers for attack to Scrum. And these are ships with pulses, rockets, railguns, artillery sometimes. Then we have ships that like to fight at the edge of web range, which is around 13 kilometers, between 10 and 13 kilometers. These are typically beam ships, sometimes railguns, sometimes artillery, sometimes rockets. It depends a bit on the bonuses. And kiting frigates are frigates that like to fight at the edge of point range, which is 24 kilometers, so basically anything beyond like 18 kilometers. These are usually light missile, drone, and sometimes beam ships. And then you have an anti-kiting style, which is essentially brawling ships, but fitted to counter kiters, to catch and kill them. Yeah, so and when you classify in your mind the opponent that you are about to fight, you should consider two key features of upcoming fight. The first one is positional advantage. The positional advantage comes from the faction warfare mechanics. If you're not familiar with them, when basically faction warfare has specific combat complexes, and any incoming ship that warps into this complex will always land at 0 at the middle of this complex. So the ship that already sits inside the complex can pick the engagement range. So kiters can just chill like 20 kilometers off a warping beacon, and brawlers can sit at 0. And it gives an obvious advantage because you can choose the engagement range that suits your ship. So if you're a brawler, you can sit at 0 and the fight will start at 0. And if you're a kiter, you can sit at 20 kilometers and the fight will always start at 20 kilometers. And the second feature is control. It's basically your ability to keep this engagement range or to change it if you are out of position at a positional disadvantage. For example, then a scrum kiter with 2 webs warps into a brawler with only 1 web. The brawler will have a positional advantage because he is inside the plex and can start the fight at 0. But a scrum kiter will have control because it will have 2 webs against 1, and therefore scrum kiter will be able to burn away, and at some point the fight will continue at scrum kiting range. As a general rule, if you have both positional advantage and control, you are very likely to win. One example of this simple principle is Rocket Hookbill against Blaster Comet. Very common matchup. If Rocket Hookbill with 2 webs sits inside Plex at a scrum kiting range, and the Blaster Comet warps into a Hookbill, the Hookbill will have both positional advantage because he is inside the Plex, and control because it has 2 webs against only 1 for Comet. And what happens is the Hookbill will apply like this much damage, and Blaster Comet will apply like this much damage. So a Comet is very likely to lose. It depends a bit on ships, bonuses, and other stuff, but this is just a very simple and general way to conceptualize a frigate PVP and think about it in a well-structured way. It will help you to understand and evaluate your fights in general. And as you get more experience, you will start to understand like some of borderline cases and exceptions from these rules. But generally, they always apply. Okay, let's switch to the Firetail itself. Usually I show this slide second and the next slide first, but I think in case of Firetail, this slide will give pretty useful context for the stuff that I will say later. So what this graph shows, it shows on the x-axis the number of 1v1 engagements in faction warfare space, and on the y-axis the average win rate against the ships that are present on this graph, so basically against other frigates. What you can see here is, well, let's talk about like a Navy combat frigates first. Navy combat frigates are Firetail, Slicer, Hookbill, and the Comet. And as you can see, this is the ship with the lowest average win rate and the lowest popularity. This is actually by a reason. I have flown Firetail quite a bit recently, just to refresh my memory before giving this class, and it's a bit lacking everywhere. It's not bad, but it's lacking both in scrum kiting style and in brawling style. It has some pretty nice features. We will talk about them later, but it's not like a clear strongest ship in a specific style. So you have to be aware of that. But like if you want to brawl a Comet, it's not gonna work, and if you want to just outright scrum kite a Hookbill, it's not gonna work either. So you need to think about something, some creative things that you can do when you engage like a clear favorites in a specific fighting styles. But that said, it's not a bad ship. It's very usable. You can have pretty decent results in this ship, but you just have to remember that it's a bit of an underdog. Okay, now let's talk about the ship in a bit more detail. On the left, you can see a big table of every frigate, every like below Tech 2 frigate in the game. These letters mean the preferred style for a frigate. So AK is an anti-kite, B is a brawler, SK is a scrum kiter, and so on. The green stuff means that this ship is very well suited for this role, and the yellow is that the ship can do it pretty decently, but there are other frigates that can do it a bit better. So the Firetail has 3 high slots, 4 medium slots, and 3 low slots, very flexible slot layout, and it has bonuses to projectile to the damage and tracking speed. The usual style for a Firetail is scrum kiting with artillery, primarily because it synergizes very nicely with high base speed and the bonus to tracking speed for artillery. But you can also use it like a anti-kiter and as a brawler as well. It's okay. Yeah, it's not bad. It's not the best in these styles, but it's very usable still. And historically, if you fight against Firetails, the data shows from the kill boards. This is for the last 2 years, stats aggregated, that it's about 50-50 between autocannons and artillery. The artillery feats are very standardized. We will talk about them a bit later. Basically, if you encounter an artillery Firetail, it will always fit in like a one way. There are not much variation here. Autocannon can be all over the place. It can be like a buffer shield, active shield, armor with tracking disruptors, armor with double webs, and so on. And there are even some dual tank Firetails. We will also talk about the specific feats a bit later. What are the general strengths and weaknesses for Firetail? Well, firstly, the main strength of his ship is the great base speed. As far as I remember, it is the fastest Navy frigate in the game, and it's actually one of the fastest frigates, Tech 1 Navy or pirate frigates overall. I think only Atron, Slasher, and Dremel are faster than the Firetail. So it's basically in the attack frigates category. So it gives you a fair bit of like a natural control, and as we will see later, even though usually Firetails fit, not usually, but quite often, especially autocannon feeds, and they feed only one web. But they are not. They still can like be competitive against ships with two webs in terms of war of control. So even though only for medium slots, you can still shield tank it and still dictate the range of engagement pretty decently. Secondly, it has a flexible slot layout, and it's pretty typical for any Minmatar frigates that you can fit them in many different ways. Not all of these feats will be like great in their own way, but it creates some value in that it's not really predictable. Like when you fight against a comet, there are like 2.5 ways to fit a comet. A blaster fit, which will be completely standard. The rail fit, which will be also completely standard, and then some weird stuff like anti-kite or kiting comets. With Firetail, you don't really know what to expect quite often, and you as a Firetail pilot can gain a bit of an advantage from that, because people will not fight perfectly against you. They will need some time to figure out what you're actually doing. And third strength is that, as I said on the previous slide, it's not really considered the best pirate navy frigate, so people will tend to engage you a bit more willingly. And sometimes you will get fights that you wouldn't get in a Comet or a Hawkbill, which is also a nice thing. Even though Firetail is not really the strongest Navy frigate, it's still pretty decent. It's not bad in itself. So what are the weaknesses? The main weakness is that Firetail doesn't really have a strong role. So if you want to scrum kite, you have to compete against rail comets and rocket hookbills, and Firetail isn't really better, to put it kindly. It may be even a bit worse. And if you want to brawl with autocannons, then you have a comet, which is just better. It doesn't mean again that the Firetail is bad, but there are ships that can arguably do the same things a bit better. And in terms of overall design of this ship, again we will see these features when we will talk about specific feats. It's not really suited to fight against larger ships, primarily destroyers. I'm talking about here, and you kind of want to have destroyers in your engagement profile when you fly Navy frigate, because there are just so many destroyers in the war zone, and it feels kind of annoying to fly a ship that can't really engage them. It just limits your engagement profile so much that you just don't get as many fights per hour when you can get in a Hawkbill or in a Comet, because you can't engage many destroyers or cruisers for that matter. But obviously cruisers won't take a significant share of your engagement profile. Destroyers is the main problem. Okay, let's talk about specific feats. I will go from the most popular feat to the least popular. Well, there are no really the least popular Firetail feats, because there is so much variation when you go into the autocannon feats. But the most popular is definitely this one. I think this Firetail feat was like the meta when I started playing 11 years ago, and it still hasn't changed since then, pretty much. I think the only thing that was added are hull rigs in 2014, and the rest is pretty much the same. So how do you fit the artillery Firetail? Well, first of all, you have 3 high slots, only 2 of them for turrets. So you fit the highest possible size of artillery, which is 280 millimeters. And then usually the utility slot is used for the rocket launcher, because newt is kind of useless when you are scrum kiting. And it's the only weapon that can apply decently at a scrum range. Your medium slots are afterburner scrum and double web. Pretty standard scrum kiting set. You will see these 4 modules on pretty much any scrum kiter, because you need great control to scrum kite, and you need double webs for that. And in the low slots, it's damage control, because hull tank is your main tank here. When you have auxiliary rep, which is like again usual addition for this type of frigates, it adds a fair bit of tank for very little fitting cost, only 5 and 5 for power grid and CPU. And your damage module is the usual here. For the rig slots, the usual again combination is 2 bulkheads. Usually you fit these ships with hull tank and not armor tank, so you don't use like a plate here and 3 marks here, because armor tank kills your top speed, and you need basically it reduces your control, because speed is a part of control. So you always want to tank in a way that doesn't hinder your control, or in this case speed. So usually you fit hull rigs, hull tank. And the DPS rig is collision and not burst, because you want to increase volley and not DPS. So this is pretty standard. I would say like there is very little variation that you can do. You can probably like replace Tech 2 damage control with replace fit Tech 2 damage control and meta gyrostab. But other than that, it's pretty standard. So what are the strengths and weaknesses for this fit? The greatest strength is that it has excellent control. It has pretty much the best control out of any Navy or Tech 1 frigate in the scrum range, because you multiply your natural base speed, which is great as I said before, with double web. So you will control anything, even double web hookbills or any double web scrum kiter for that matter. You will have a small control advantage over them. And in practice, it means that you can engage a lot of targets even at a certain disadvantage, because usually you can leave when you want to. Especially in this feat, which will always fight not by orbiting but by aligning out at a certain celestial to minimize transversal. So you can engage a lot of targets. You just have to realize when you're losing the fight and when it's time to leave. And your like kill to loss ratio will be quite high, even though on paper this ship is a bit weaker than our scrum kiters, just purely because of your excellent control. The second advantage is that it relies on alpha damage. It means that you apply a huge amount of damage, but very rarely. It's called alpha. You can see like it's a volley against DPS. It has a huge volley, but it just comes very rarely. It's quite awkward to fight against alpha damage frigates, especially when you are in a frigate that relies on active tank. For example, medium ancillary shield booster hookbill. The problem is when the volley arrives, it usually like pushes you either into armor or into hull. and usually you want to repair as much as possible before the next volley arrives. But at the same time, you don't want to overwrap. And when you don't overwrap, you don't repair to full hit points. And when the next volley arrives, it pushes you even further into the hull, and so on. So you kind of sometimes face a choice between not using your active tank as efficiently as possible and basically overwrapping to have a full hit point before the next volley arrives. Or you have to take risks that the next volley may simply kill you, because you'll continue bleeding into hull or into armor or whatever is your secondary tank. Firetail also has good application because of a tracking bonus and double web. Usually the biggest problem for artillery feats is application, but here it's not really an issue if you have both webs applied, so your volley will be close to maximum. The weaknesses are, as I mentioned before, that it kind of doesn't excel against other options for scrum kiters. Like Rocket Hookbill or Rail Comet, they will quite likely out DPS you if they play everything, if they do everything correctly. Obviously, it doesn't mean that you will lose because you have control advantage. So generally against Rail Comet, it's very easy. You can just warp off pretty much any time you want, because Rail Comet just doesn't have control at all against you. Against Rocket Hookbill, it can be a bit trickier because the difference in control comes down only to your base speed. You both will have double webs. So it may come down to the piloting, skills, whether you had positional advantage or not, and so on. But it's also possible. You will be a bit quicker on a Rocket Hookbill. And one thing I didn't really mention here, but I think it's worth saying, is that artillery Firetail relies a bit, not really relies, but the outcome of a fight may depend on turret RNG. If you're not familiar with that, the actual damage of a turret in EVE is a bit random, so you can roll like a grace, a hit, and some like other types of shot, and depending on what you roll, you may apply more or less when you're like a baseline volley. In a ship that shoots very often, like Rail Comet, for example, Blaster Comet, or Rocket Hookbill, this RNG doesn't really matter because over a large sample size, you will usually come around the middle anyway. But for an artillery ship that shoots very rarely, it actually matters whether you roll like a large damage shot or a low damage shot. And sometimes you can be just really unlucky and during the whole fight roll like 70% of low damage shots, and it affects your actual DPS output by quite a bit. There is nothing you can do about it, obviously. It's just a game design, a bit weird game design. I never really understand why they introduced such a large randomness in turret DPS, but it has been in the game since the beginning, I think, so we can't really do anything about it. Yeah, you just have to remember that sometimes you just get unlucky and you roll like a terrible shots, and sometimes you roll a wrecking shot which will apply like 3 times the baseline volley, and you will kill a guy completely randomly. It just happens. Okay, let's talk about autocannon feats. So here, as I said, there is no like an established meta. There is no good feats. There is no most popular feats. The feats that I will show you I think they are decent. I tested them, they work fine. I'm not sure if they are the best, but from my experience, they work okay. This is like a fair warning before I go into the details. Okay, autocannon firetails. So what you want to do first is to fit again the highest size of autocannons. Firetail relies on fall-off quite a bit, as you can see here, only less than a kilometer of optimal range and the rest is fall-off. So the larger guns you fit, the more fall-off you will have and the more applied damage you will have. It may not be seen from the damage per second number, but when you calculate it relative to the distance, you will see that it's always beneficial to have the highest autocannons possible, the largest autocannons possible. Next, you always want to have a newt in your fit, because this is one of your win conditions against strong brawlers. Generally, Firetail cannot outbrawl a specialized brawler, simply because autocannons are not the best weapon for brawling, and Firetail does not have a tank to rely on tank when it's lacking damage. So against a Comet, you will lack both damage and tank. So you need something else to win, and that something else is a newt. Ideally, you want Tech 2 newt, but it's not always possible. But if you want to invest a couple of millions into a fitting implant, like a 601 or 602 CPU implant, you can fit the Tech 2 newt. It's quite beneficial because it gives you more range and more newting power. As for the medium slots, the usual Afterburner, Web, and Scrum, and I personally prefer the ancillary fit because it doesn't boost your signature. It's quite easy to upscale. You can use a lot of drugs to increase the effectiveness of ancillary shield booster. But it's not the only option. I will show you a different fit later. And for the low slots, your damage control, your gyrostop, and I usually fit overdrive here. You can also fit a nano. The idea behind overdrives or nanos in the low slot is they basically replace a second web. So you have great base speed to begin with, and then you add a module that increases your speed. So even though your opponent might have double web, your base speed kind of mitigates the second web, and you will eventually have a similar control. And the rig slots are standard to resist rigs because you have an active tank and the DPS rig. You can play around the rig layout. You can, for example, fit like a full tank, but I think it's a standard layout when you have one DPS module in the low slot and one rig. But generally you can play around it a little bit. So what are the strengths and weaknesses? The main strength is that this ship can kind of do everything. It just does everything not perfectly. You are fine to fight against brawlers out of position. You are generally fine to fight against scrum kiters out of position. Like scrum kiters have to be very careful because your initial burst of afterburner will usually put you quite close to them if we are not careful. You can fight in position, but it's not really required. So you can kind of be very flexible in terms of your target selection. Newt is quite important because since you often will be able to dictate the range of an engagement, or at least maintain it, it means that you will apply newt constantly, newting pressure constantly. And unlike many other frigates that have to kind of balance their energy consumption between newt and ancillary rep, like Comet for example, it can't really run a newt constantly because you have to run your tank as well. which requires capacitor, and many weapons also require capacitor, but not in Minmatar frigates. So as you can see, you are completely stable. You can just pressure capacitor of your opponent constantly, and when fight is like longer than 30 to 40 seconds, it actually creates a pretty significant problems for ships like comets, because comets, well, first of all, we have to recognize it very quickly and stop running the ancillary rep. And second, even when they do, they may still run out of cap at the end. And then it creates a whole bunch of problems, because you will have to like frantically manage your guns at the edge of your capacitor, of your remaining capacitor, and your control. And sometimes when you actually push the capacitor low enough, the fight may just suddenly turn around. So you may like feel like you're losing, and when the opponent just runs out of cap and you suddenly start winning. Newt is very important for this type of feats, because it creates some win conditions that will not be possible without them. And again, this is basically the repetition of stuff that I said before. The Firetail is not a specialized brawler or a specialized scrum-kiter. So when you engage a hookbill out of position and the hookbill does everything perfectly in terms of his initial engagement range, screening you off outside of a Newton range and so on, and then like controlling you when you want to leave, you generally will lose. But it's very difficult to execute correctly, and many people will make mistakes. So you can still engage in these situations just fine. You just need a little bit of help from your opponent, and it usually comes, because it's just very difficult micromanagement. What would be the variations for this feat? What you can do is to feat double overdrive or double nano. The gyrostab actually adds fairly little in terms of overall damage output for these fall-off reliant frigates, so you can just go full control and feat double overdrive to double nanos. It depends on your preferences. Nanos will give you a bit less speed, a bit more agility, and a bit less tank, and overdrives will just give you the raw speed, but it will not affect the agility, and it will not affect the tank. This is basically a variation of a very popular Jamiel feat, autocannon Jamiel, what was invented like 2 or 3 years ago, where you feat like only one web, shield tank, and double overdrives on nanos, and these speed modules compensate for the web, for the lack of web. The Firetail, or the Dremel for that matter, with double overdrive or double nanos, will have comparable control, or even better control in some cases than double web frigates. So you kind of transform the lack of medium slot into a low slot. And you can also upgrade when you fit overdrive, you can upgrade everything else. So you can fit Tech 2 Newt easily, because you will have more CPU available. And you can fit Tech 2 damage control if you want, or you can fit Tech 2 web if you want to get a little bit more control, even 60% against 55. So it's a possible variation. You can use that, or you can use that. They're both pretty decent. Okay, I think it's a final fit I wanted to show you. It's very similar to the previous one. but the only difference is that you use buffer tank instead of the active tank. And the slightly different selection of rigs is just a small optimization depending on what kind of tank you're running, active or buffer. The rest is pretty much the same. So in terms of like strengths and weaknesses, first two are the same. The only like additional thing that you gain is that it's easier to use. So if you are new, you might a bit struggle with ancillary rep management. It needs to be as efficient as possible. And this fit can be a bit easier to manage because you will just have one less thing to worry about. But on the other hand, you gain a couple of weaknesses. One weakness is that you have to repair between fights. You can't really wait to regenerate your shield. You need to dock on dock. And it can be a bit annoying when you have like one fight and when you start repairing everything, looting, and when you see another ship outside. When you are in ancillary fit, usually by that time you're fully reloaded, repaired, and ready to go. But with this fit, you can't stay. You have to leave, dock on dock, regenerate your shield, and go back again. And it's a bit expensive. Usually Firetails are like 20 to 22 million, but here you have to use faction medium shield extender. Tech 2 just, I think it doesn't fit and it doesn't really work in general. So you really want a faction shield extender, and it increases the price of whole fit by almost 50%. And if you want to like make it even stronger, you don't really have any options other than like snakes that work for any frigate or nirvans. With active tank, you can just use blue pill, hard shell, and so on, and it boosts your effectiveness by quite a bit cheaply. But here it's not possible, unfortunately. There are many other variations. You can try things like Firetails with double shield extender. I have seen them occasionally and just use them as a brawler. I personally think they are not flexible enough to be viable, but sometimes you will see these fits. You can also fit them like a glorified slasher with armor tank and track and disruptor in the medium slot. But it's less efficient because your signature is not as tiny as on a slasher. But you can kind of try it. I have seen also feats that use double web and just armor tank, but I also don't think they are particularly strong against like relative to hookbill, for example. You just don't have anything going for you compared to the hookbill. With this fit, you at least have a newt and like a respectable tank. But with an armor fit, your tank is horrible, and I don't think you can even fit a newt. It will be pretty tight, but probably you can. Yeah, so there are other variations. I personally don't like them, but it doesn't mean that they are not viable. I just never really made them work for me. So these are two autocannon fits that I feel like are decent enough to recommend. Okay, finally let's talk about the engagement map, what you can and cannot fight. This table shows the results of all 1v1 engagements in the last 2 years approximately. So this is Firetail against each of these ships. And first column is the kills, the second one is losses, the third one is mirrors, only Firetail against Firetail is a mirror. The fourth one is the total, and the final column is the win rate relative to Firetail. So for example, Firetail has 85% 1v1 win rate against Tech 1 frigates and 82% win rate against Tristan, and so on. This is how you read this table. So what you can fight? Well, Tech 1 frigates are generally quite easy. They will be slower, usually. The exceptions are Atron and Slasher. And they will not have the same damage and DPS, just because they are Tech 1 and you are faction, and that's how the game works, unfortunately. So usually it just will come down to the DPS race that you will win like 90% of the time, unless something really weird happens. As for the Navy frigates, the vast majority of your engagement profile will be fights against Comet and Hookbill. As you can see, almost 1 out of 4 fights against frigates will be either against Comet or against a Hookbill. So these fights are pretty tricky. Like, as you can see, the win rates are pretty low. In my experience, it's not really the Hookbill, not really the Firetail fault. It's like usually comes down to just management of your fight. What you should remember when you fight against these ships? Well, firstly, you have advantage in control against Comet, especially. You can always leave. You just have to time it right. Second, you have a newt, and against Comet, it will be quite impactful. You just need to manage your range properly. You should fight outside of outside of Void or Faction ammo for the Comet, but inside the optimal for your newt. And it will be pretty competitive fight in this case. Obviously, if you just try to outbrawl at 0, it won't work. And against Rail Comet, again, you have the control, so even when you are out of position, you can always push into the optimal of your newt and make something work that way. Against a Hookbill, your control will be a bit weaker, usually. So it always comes down to the position and how the Hookbill pilot managed the initial like 10 seconds of a fight. Quite often Hookbills engage Firetails too close, like they engage them at 7 or 8 kilometers, which is standard scrum kiting range, but you actually have to engage Firetails a bit further down to kind of dampen the initial speed burst from the afterburner of Firetail. Because if you don't do it and start at like 8 kilometers, usually by the time all control modules are applied, these 8 kilometers will turn into like 4 kilometers, and it's fine for Firetail pilot. And after that, you will not be able to burn, at least quick enough as a Hookbill, because the control will be quite similar. Yeah, but if Hookbill pilot manages everything correctly, then it's a difficult fight, when you probably want to start in position rather than out of position. Against Slicer, it's pretty straightforward. If it's a kiting Slicer, you need to refit to anti-kite feed and then just kill a Slicer, because Firetail is a great anti-kiter. But if you are caught by a kiting Slicer in afterburner feed, then you're of course gonna die. Vigil fleets are extremely tricky. Usually you want to be in position against Vigil fleets, because unlike Hookbills, Vigil fleets will often webkite, and against webkiters they have sufficient range between you and them, and you won't be able to do the same trick as against a Hookbill. So generally when you see a Vigil fleet, you want to be in position to engage. The rest are, I think, rare enough to skip them. For the pirate frigates, your engagement profile are essentially kite garmors when you fly an anti-kite frigates, and some weak and Utin ships like Damovik and Kroor, because as you have seen, you are not really vulnerable to Newton in a Firetail, and this is their main strength. But these ships nowadays are so rare that you probably never see them anyway. So in terms of frigates, you should engage all Tech 1, all Navy, and some pirate frigates, as I mentioned. For the destroyers, it's difficult. We can kind of return to the point that I made in the beginning of this class, that Firetail can't really fight against larger ships. So when you are in a artillery fit, you generally should engage, because you will have so much control that even when you start losing, you can leave. You can just leave. It's not a problem. The problem is you just have so little tank that even though you have control, you can't really win the grid. So you will always get just pushed away from grid by even like a blaster catalyst. But you should try. Like if you fly artillery Firetail, you should engage pretty much everything. Except maybe Algos is just gonna be difficult against drones, and Dragoon, because newts and drones doesn't work very well. But you have to remember that very often you will have to leave. And if you remember that, then you can engage. And as for the autocannon Firetails, it doesn't work very well because you, as a autocannon Firetail, often rely on your newt. And destroyers just have larger capacitor pool and more DPS. So you're on a much shorter timer to newt them out when you're fighting against a frigate. And it's not really feasible. It's very unlikely that you will be able to newt out someone in a destroyer. And you will be way more committed in terms of range when you fly artillery Firetail. So yeah, as I said, it's tricky. You can try in some cases, but it will be tricky. Navy frigates and anything larger, I would personally avoid. Cruisers and Navy destroyers, pretty much for the reasons that I mentioned just now. And against assault frigates, it's also pretty difficult fights. You can fight ships where your newt will make a difference, I would put it this way. So against things like Hawks, pretty much no chance. Vengeance as well, Jaguar as well, pretty difficult. But ships like Enios, Retributions, Harpies, you can try. It's very difficult because they just have a lot of DPS and a lot of tank. So you kind of have to pray that your newt will make a difference before you will run out of tank. But it's possible to engage, especially if you are in like if you are in autocannon Firetail, you can engage with ships, and if you are in artillery Firetail, then generally you should engage like almost everything because you will have control in scrum range. Same logic as in the destroyers. But again, it's difficult fights. These are difficult fights. So to summarize, your engagement profile generally Tech 1 frigates, Navy frigates, some faction frigates, some pirate frigates, some destroyers, and some assault frigates. Larger stuff I wouldn't really touch at all. Okay, I think this is everything I wanted to say. If you have any questions, you can ask them in Classroom Alpha or on Mumble in voice if you want. I will give like a minute for you to ask questions, and if there are no questions, then we will wrap this up. If you want to watch lectures for our combat frigates, then you can either go to the EVE Uni forums and just search for my previous announcements, or you can go to the website that's linked here, Frigate's Patreon. Everything is there, like nicely structured, and it's free. You don't need to sub or anything. All lectures are available. You don't even need to register, I think. You can just watch them there. Okay, so looks like there are no questions. So I want to say thank you for coming. I will do similar lectures for our frigates in the future. So keep an eye on the announcements. And if you will see what I'm about to run a class about a ship that's interesting to you, then please come. I will be happy to see you again. Alright, thank you for coming, and see you in the next ones.